Into the New Century, Part 2. A new president for a new century. In 2000, the Democrats nominated Vice President Al Gore, who chose Joseph Lieberman as his running mate. The Republicans chose Texas Governor George W. Bush, who chose Richard Cheney as his running mate. Both candidates promised tax cuts, but Bush proposed a much larger cut than Gore. Gore promised to strengthen Social Security with the surplus funds from the tax cuts. Consumer advocate Ralph Nader ran as the Green Party candidate. He accused both Gore and Bush of being dependent on money from large corporations. On Election Day, voters split almost evenly. The election came down to the state of Florida. The results in Florida were so close that state law required a recount of the ballots using vote counting machines. The machines threw out thousands of ballots because they could not determine a vote for president. So Gore asked for a hand recount. Vote counters tried to determine what voters intended, and different counties used different standards. When it became clear that not all of the recounts would be finished on time, Gore went to court to overturn the deadline. The Supreme Court set a new deadline for completion of the recounts. The United States Supreme Court overturned the Florida Supreme Court decision to extend the deadline, and George W. Bush was named president without ever having counted the votes. George W. Bush's history, experience, and education. Law enforcement. George W. Bush was arrested in Kennebunkport, Maine in 1976 for driving under the influence of alcohol. He pleaded guilty, paid a fine, and had his driver's license suspended for 30 days. His Texas driving record has been lost and is not available. Military. He joined the Texas Air National Guard and went AWOL. He refused to take a drug test or answer any questions about drug use. By joining the Texas Air National Guard, he was able to avoid combat duty in Vietnam. College. He graduated from Yale University with a low C average. George W. Bush was a cheerleader. Past work experience. He ran for U.S. Congress and lost. Bush began his career in the oil business in Midland, Texas in 1975. He bought an oil company with family money and couldn't find any oil in Texas. The company went bankrupt shortly after he sold all of his stock. He bought a baseball team called the Texas Rangers and a sweetheart deal that took land using taxpayer money. With the help of his father and friends in the oil industry, including Enron CEO Ken Lay, Bush was elected governor of Texas. Accomplishments as governor of Texas. He changed Texas pollution laws to favor power and oil companies, making Texas the most polluted state in the Union. During his tenure, Houston replaced Los Angeles as the most smog-ridden city in America. He cut taxes and nearly bankrupted the Texas Treasury to the tune of billions in borrowed money. He set the record for most executions by any governor in American history. With the help of his brother, the governor of Florida, and his father's appointments to the Supreme Court, he became president after losing the popular vote by over 500,000 votes. Bush becomes president. During the 2000 election campaign, the U.S. economy began to slow. The stock market dropped and many internet-based technology companies went out of business. President Bush's first priority in office was to cut taxes to boost the economy. Congress passed a large tax cut. The tax cuts decreased tax revenue, but federal spending increased. This drained the economy, turning budget surpluses into record-high deficits. Congress passed education bills requiring states to conduct annual reading and math tests for all public school children in grades 3 through 8, a program called No Child Left Behind. President Bush wanted to reform Medicare. In November 2003, Congress passed a bill that added prescription drug benefits to Medicare. Congress also reacted to a rash of corporate scandals, tightening account regulations and increasing the penalties for dishonest corporate executives. Bush called for a new military program designed to meet the needs of the post-Cold War world. He strongly favored strategic defense, the effort to develop missiles and other devices that could shoot down nuclear missiles before they hit the United States. On September 11, 2001, terrorists struck the United States, and the event changed everything. Did you know? Before the terrorist attacks on the United States on September 11, 2001, the worst terrorist attack ever on American soil occurred in April of 1995, when a bomb blast at the federal government office building in Oklahoma City killed 168 people and wounded hundreds more. This was not the work of foreign terrorists, however. The bombers were part of a segment of Americans on the fringe of society who believed the federal government should be overthrown. September 11, 2001. Thousands of people died in these acts of terrorism, the use of violence by non-governmental groups against civilians to achieve a political goal. Middle Eastern groups have carried out many terrorist attacks on the United States. Oil became important to the American economy in the 1920s, so the United States invested in the oil industry in the Middle East. Some Middle Easterners became angry at the United States for helping ruling families in some Middle Eastern kingdoms to become very wealthy, while most of the people remained poor. The growth of the oil industry increased the Middle East's contact with Western society. Western ideas spread throughout the region, and devout Muslims feared their traditional values and beliefs were being weakened. Throughout the Middle East, new movements arose, calling for a return to traditional Muslim religious laws and a strict interpretation of the Quran, the Muslim holy book. The movements also sought to overthrow pro-Western governments in the Middle East and to establish pure Islamic society. Muslims who support these movements are called fundamentalist militants. Most Muslims believe terrorism is against their faith. Americans' support of Israel angered many in the Middle East. In 1947, the UN divided Palestine into two territories. One part became Israel. The other part was supposed to be a Palestinian state. Instead, fighting between Israel and Arab states left this territory under control of Israel, Jordan, and Egypt. In the 1950s, Palestinians began holding guerrilla raids and terrorist attacks against Israel. The United States became a target because it gave military and economic aid to Israel. The governments of Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Iran have secretly supported state-sponsored terrorism. In 1979, Osama bin Laden, a wealthy Saudi Arabian, joined the struggle in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union's invasion of the country. He used his wealth to support the Afghan resistance, and in 1988 he founded the Al-Qaeda, or the base. This organization recruited Muslims and channeled money and arms to the Afghan resistance. Bin Laden believed Western ideas had contaminated Muslim society. He was outraged when Saudi Arabia allowed American troops on Saudi soil when Iraq invaded Kuwait. In 1998, he issued a statement calling on Muslims to kill Americans. Bin Laden's followers set off bombs on American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. The United States began airstrikes against training bases connected with Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan and Sudan. In October 2000, terrorists attacked the USS Cole, an American warship, while it was docked in the Middle Eastern country of Yemen. When terrorists attacked the United States on September 11, 2001, Americans responded rapidly to the crisis by donating money, blood, and supplies. Across the nation, flags were flown to show unity and resolve. On September 14, 2001, President Bush declared a national emergency, and Congress voted to use force to fight the terrorists. The FBI began a massive investigation which soon identified the attacks as the work of Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda network. President Bush announced that the war on terrorism would start against Al-Qaeda, but would also be waged against every terrorist group around the globe, including states that aided or harbored terrorists. the president announced the creation of a new federal agency, the Department of Homeland Security, to coordinate the dozens of federal agencies and departments working to prevent terrorism. Congress drafted a new anti-terrorist law in late October 2001. It permitted secret searches and allowed authorities to obtain a single nationwide search warrant. It also made it easier to wiretap suspects and allowed authorities to track internet communications and seize voicemail. Terrorists posed a new threat when they began to use the mail to spread anthrax, a type of bacteria that can be lethal if left undetected. Several occurrences of anthrax were found, but no suspects were publicly recognized. On October 7, 2001, the United States launched the first military operations of the War on Terrorism. Warplanes began bombing targets in Afghanistan. The U.S. also began sending military aid to a coalition of Afghan groups known as the Northern Alliance, who had been fighting a civil war with the Taliban for several years. By early December, the Taliban government had collapsed, and the surviving Taliban and al-Qaeda forces had fled. Thousands of American and Allied troops arrived in Afghanistan to act as peacekeepers and to hunt for al-Qaeda terrorists. The September 11, 2001 attacks led to fears that al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups would acquire weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons, which could kill tens of thousands of people all at once. In January 2002, President Bush warned of the grave threat to the world posed by Iraq, Iran, and North Korea, which he called an axis of evil. All three countries had sponsored terrorists and were suspected of developing weapons of mass destruction.
From threatening America or our friends and allies with weapons of mass destruction. Some of these regimes have been pretty quiet since September the 11th, but we know their true nature. North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. This is a regime that has already used poison gas to murder thousands of its own citizens, leaving the bodies of mothers huddled over their dead children. This is a regime that agreed to international inspections, then kicked out the inspectors. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger. They could provide these arms to terrorists, giving them the means to match their hatred. They could attack our allies or attempt to blackmail the United States. In any of these cases, The price of indifference would be catastrophic. We will work closely with our coalition to deny terrorists and their state sponsors the materials, technology, and expertise to make and deliver weapons of mass destruction. We will develop and deploy effective missile defenses to protect America and our allies from sudden attack.
In October 2002, North Korea announced that it had resumed its nuclear weapons program. The Bush administration was not able to persuade North Korea to stop the program. President Bush considered Iraq a more immediate threat than North Korea in developing and distributing weapons of mass destruction. Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons twice in the 1980s and after the Gulf War. UN inspectors had found evidence that Iraq had biological weapons and was working on a nuclear bomb. In the summer of 2002, President Bush called for a regime change in Iraq. He asked the United Nations to support a war against Iraq and to demand that Iraq give up its weapons of mass destruction. Weapons inspectors returned to Iraq. The Bush administration pushed for a war resolution in the United Nations Security Council. He argued that a preemptive war was justified because of the imminent threat posed by Iraq. France and Russia refused to back it, but the United States and about 30 other countries prepared for war as many anti-war protests took place around the world. On March 20th, 2003, the U.S.-led coalition forces attacked Iraq and quickly seized control. On March 1st, President Bush declared that the major combat was over. However, the fighting and controversy continued. Americans found no evidence of weapons of mass destruction. American deaths and expenses were mounting. President Bush began to seek support from the United Nations to help stabilize and rebuild Iraq. The path toward a free, stable Iraq was proving to be long and difficult.
Suiciders to kill innocent life, who had relations with Zarqawi. Imagine what the world would be like with him in power. The idea is to try to help change the Middle East. Now look, part of the reason we went into Iraq was the main reason we went into Iraq at the time was we thought he had weapons of mass destruction. It turns out he didn't, but he had the capacity to make weapons of mass destruction. But I also talked about the human suffering in Iraq, and I also talked the need to advance a freedom agenda. And so my answer to your question is that imagine a world in which Saddam Hussein was there, stirring up even more trouble in a part of the world that had so much resentment and so much hatred that people came and killed 3,000 of our citizens. You know, I've heard this theory about, everything was just fine until we arrived, and then, kind of stir up the hornet's nest theory. It just doesn't hold water as far as I'm concerned. The terrorists attacked us and killed 3,000 of our citizens before we started the freedom agenda in the Middle East. What did Iraq have to do with what?
The attack on the World Trade Center.
Nothing, except for it's part of, and nobody's ever suggested in this administration that Saddam Hussein ordered the attack. Iraq was the lesson of September 11th is take threats before they fully materialize, Ken. Nobody's ever suggested that the attacks of September the 11th were ordered by Iraq. I have suggested, however, that resentment and the lack of hope create the breeding grounds for terrorists who are willing to use suiciders to kill to achieve an objective. I have made that case. And one way to defeat that, defeat resentment, is with hope. And the best way to do hope is through a form of government. Now, I said going...
The 2004 elections. The war on terrorism and the war in Iraq dominated the election of 2004 between the Republican Bush-Cheney ticket and the Democratic nominees, Massachusetts Senator John Kerry and North Carolina Senator John Edwards. The Vietnam War became a campaign issue. Bush and Cheney did not serve in Vietnam. Kerry volunteered for service and was decorated for valor, but returned a critic of the war. Bush and Kerry offered voters a sharp choice. Bush, a conservative, wanted to cut taxes, build a stronger military, and was opposed to abortion and same-sex marriage. Senator Kerry, a liberal, wanted to strengthen Social Security and raise taxes on the wealthiest in order to fund health care coverage for millions. He criticized what he considered President Bush's single-mindedness. Bush's supporters were in the southeast, southwest, rural areas, and outer suburbs. Kerry's supporters were in the northeast, the west coast, cities, and inner suburbs. President Bush took the lead in the popular vote and a majority in the Electoral College. Despite serious concerns, most voters decided to stay the course. During his presidency, George W. Bush was forced to dodge many obstacles.
And again, one of the television correspondents at this news conference in which the president is there on an unannounced visit, part of a ceremonial signing of the agreement, and you see it there, one right after the other. One of the journalists jumps up, throwing the shoes at the president. Let's listen in. And we have been looking at video that just arrived here a few moments ago, video of a news conference with President Bush and Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki as they talked about their signing of this agreement, the Status of Forces Agreement and Strategic Agreement. Let's listen in to the reaction. Amazing. You see one of the journalists there. We are getting reports that he is from Al-Baghdadiya Television. A correspondent at this press conference reportedly says this is the end, makes the statement, this is the end, just before throwing the shoes. Patty Culhane joins us now live from the White House. Patty?
Hey, Christina, how are you? As you've just seen the video, President Bush, we should point out, was not injured. As you saw, the shoes